Hello, I'm here with Charles Hendry, the former Minister of State for Energy and Climate Change. He is also a member of the Tory Reform Group. Mr. Hendry, thank you for joining me. One of the key elements of Britain's relationship with Europe is the single market. Could you explain how this works for me?
The intention with the single market is that we should remove as many barriers to trade as possible. We should try to make Europe function as one economic area. And that what's happened over the course of decades really is gradually dismantling the barriers to trade. Some were very obvious, some were very upfront, some have been much more subtle. And that what's happened over time is just to make it so that companies from whichever country they're based in the European Union can operate freely in others. There will always be barriers of language, but that's something which companies have to get around themselves. But what should happen is that they should be able to seek contracts, seek consumers in other countries without there being an artificial barrier to them being able to operate there.
What are the effects on British businesses?
Extremely positive. Now, clearly people often focus on the fact that it does mean that other companies from overseas have been able to access our consumers. But in many ways that's been good for consumers. The competition, for example, in the electricity sector led to us having the cheapest electricity and gas prices across the whole of Europe. And so it was beneficial from that respect. But where we didn't see it working the other way was that we have many, many millions, tens of millions of electricity consumers in the UK who get their electricity from French or German companies, but really nobody in France or Germany who gets their electricity from a British company. So it's still not working as we would wish it to do. But what it has done, that openness, that transparency, has meant that the UK is the most attractive market in Europe for businesses to invest in. And when we see international companies coming here, setting up manufacturing facilities or European headquarters here, that's been a really important driver for our economic success. And one of the reasons for that is because we are willing to operate in a very open way.
So why is that the case? Why aren't we seeing more British businesses exporting energy to the rest of Europe?
Because there has been resistance. A lot of the companies in Europe have been vertically integrated. So, for example, we've seen with the German companies that they own the generating facilities, sometimes they own the distribution systems, they certainly have the consumer base. And so they use their own electricity to feed to their consumers. I think what we're going to move to is a more open market where you'll see a breakdown between those who generate electricity and those who sell it. And that will be good for consumers because those companies which sell it, the retailers, will have to buy around more and to get the best deal for their consumers. So breaking down those vertically integrated companies is going to be something which is good for consumers.
What can the government do to make that happen?
Well, the European Union is already making much of that happen. The European Union and the Energy Commissioner have been driving forward some of those changes of gradually opening it up. In a rather sort of European way, they call it the third energy package, so not a very snappy title, but a lot of areas in there which require the unbundling of energy companies to say that if they are involved in generation, of generating power, they shouldn't also be involved in transmitting power. And so breaking up it into smaller units which have a clearer part of the market in which they operate. And now that's something which we've already been driving through in the United Kingdom. We've still got some vertical integration here, probably more than we would wish. But nevertheless, what we're now seeing across Europe is a greater openness.
How would you like to see Britain's relationship with the rest of Europe develop?
I think that the focus should be on trade, the focus should be on business. I support the fact that we should be looking for a renegotiated settlement for Europe. The way in which it's operating now has clearly lost the support of many people because it seemed to be too much on politics and not enough on trade. That it is important that the benefits for our consumers in every country will come by being able to get the best deal wherever it happens to be on offer. And so making it easier for companies to do business internationally should be the absolute top priority of the European Union. But in energy, there's another important element, which is energy security has been greatly enhanced by the European Union. The fact that they have put a lot of focus on where you put the gas pipelines between countries, the electricity interconnectors between countries. It makes it much more difficult for one country to be stranded because its gas supply gets cut off. And so that the energy security for the whole of Europe has been greatly enhanced.
So much of the national debate is about the political issues surrounding Europe and the decision-making process. It's hard to divorce the economics from the politics, but where do you see Britain's economic future in Europe?
Europe has to become very competitive. Too often some of the approaches appear to be more about creating a fortress Europe where we remove the barriers internally, but we don't do enough in terms of our external focus. Europe has to compete with the Far East. I'm also the Prime Minister's trade envoy to the Caspian, to Kazakhstan, Azerbaijan, Turkmenistan. These are very fast-growing countries. They're growing at 10% a year. Over the course of the next few decades, the world's economy is going to treble in size. So an enormous growth from $80 trillion to $250 trillion, the economy will grow. Now, we can either decide to be part of Europe or even a smaller UK market, or we can say the well-being of our people depends on being able to capture a share of that global growth. So British companies have always been outward-looking. We are a trading nation. Our very history has been based on the fact that we've been driven by people who looked overseas for new opportunities and new markets. And we have to make it clear that Europe now has to be of that outward-looking approach. So it shouldn't be focusing too much on its own internal issues, important though that is. It should be how we make European companies the most efficient, the most productive in the world.
So what can be done to bring down the barriers of entry to the trade bloc of the European Union?
In a way that moves it outside the European Union, and then you start to work with the World Trade Organization. We're very keen to support the membership of other countries. Russia coming in is an important step. That we need to see within those organizations like the OECD greater participation from the fast-growing emerging markets like China, which is not part of the OECD. And so the Organization of Economic Cooperation and Development. And so that trying to bring those fast-growing new markets into those same open market structures is a really important objective.
Britain doesn't have a seat on the World Trade Organization. Does that matter?
I don't think it matters too much that we don't, because that in many ways the model which we have is open, that we don't need to be there steering the policy. We're saying to other people, look, if you want to trade with us, if you want to emulate what we have been able to achieve overseas, which is still exceptional, then actually the model which we've got here works well. The freedom of movement of capital, the ease of access to other markets, that there's government support for countries going outside it. We still need to do better. So that in the markets which I'm involved in, then we need to do more to get more British companies to explore those. It's like a new frontier which they have to get beyond. But nevertheless, I think that the leadership which we can give in terms of showing how our market is open and does function well is a strong signal in itself.
Going back to energy, do you think there's a place for government subsidies?
Oh, there will always be a place for government subsidies. Every sort of source of energy has always needed subsidy. So historically, oil and gas had a lot of subsidy support in the United Kingdom. As we look at whether shale gas should be part of the future, there'd be public tax breaks for that. Nuclear has had big subsidies. Even today, about 2/3 of the Department for Energy and Climate Change's budget is on nuclear decommissioning, so a continuing major subsidy for old nuclear. And so if we want to see new sources of power generation coming on stream, then they're going to need support as they compete with the well-established mature industries. And so it's quite right that we should be subsidising those as they come through. But subsidies should be a way of driving down their costs. It should be getting them to a stage where that they're of sufficient magnitude, you get the economies of scale coming in, that they can then drive their costs down. So subsidies should actually be declining over time, rather than just locked in for a long period. Because what we want is the companies always to be looking to how they can be more efficient, how they can drive those costs down to get a better deal for consumers. And it's working. If you look at offshore wind, we price these things in a rather obscure way. We call them pounds per megawatt hour. So for each megawatt generated for an hour, what is the cost of that? Well, offshore wind has been about 130, 140 pounds a megawatt hour. By 2020, it will be down to 100 or below. And so approaching 1/3 of its cost will have been taken out in the course of a decade. And that's because the subsidy regime is saying, look, we're tightening up the subsidy, that only the most efficient projects, the ones which deliver the most electricity at the lowest price, are going to be successful in the course of that work. And so subsidies have enabled that to develop. The UK as a market leader in offshore wind. We hope to get a lot of the supply chain companies coming here as well, and over time subsidies will be reduced.
The energy sector is one with huge demand. Why isn't it possible for private companies to pick up the cost?
As we move towards a low carbon economy, the nature of that investment is changing. If you build a gas plant, a gigawatt gas plant, a big gas plant, then you'll spend some hundreds of millions building it. But then on day one, when you start to generate, you start getting money back. And so as you start buying the gas to put into it, you've actually already got an income. If you're building a nuclear power station, you're spending many billions up front, and you get absolutely no return on that investment until it's all ready and you've got much of the fuel already in there. The cost is in the construction of the plant, not in the running costs. Similarly, if you're building an offshore wind farm, billions of pounds to build an offshore wind farm, but minimal running costs. And so you need a very different sort of investor. And if you're going to be asking an investor to put billions of pounds at risk in a certain type of energy investment, then they've got to have confidence that they'll get their money back and they'll make a return on that investment. And so what we've done through market reform is to say, look, if you're investing in a low carbon source of generation, then we will guarantee the price you get for a period of in nuclear's case, up to 35 years. So for sort of 2/3 of the lifetime of the project. After that, we assume that people have made a good return, and so it'll be up to them to price it accordingly afterwards. But without those price signals, then and that price certainty, it would be impossible to get the investment, because the sums of money up front are so huge that people simply couldn't do it without those sort of clear signals.
So if that is the case, surely it makes sense for the energy sector to be owned by the government.
No, I don't think so, because in the energy sector, what we've seen in the United Kingdom has been a failure to invest over many years. That the last coal plant to be built in this country was commissioned when I was born in the late 1950s. The last nuclear plant was commissioned 25 years ago. And that it's always been easy to put off investment in new plant. And if government was entirely in charge of that, they're always going to say, look, election coming up, people are more worried about hospitals, they're more worried about universities, they're more worried about schools or police or aspects like that, things which are more visible. And so let's put off that new power plant for a little bit longer. And so I think actually having a market where it's clearly regulated, there's an obligation on the companies now to invest for future need of consumers. We've still got to attract them to come and invest here, but it's a better way. It's also less of a burden on the UK consumer. And if you look at, for example, the new nuclear power station, which is going to be built, then that will be significantly funded by the Chinese. And so Chinese sovereign wealth funds coming in, investing in here, and so it's not people who are competing for funds in the United Kingdom, is bringing in an entirely new source of international investment.
Charles, thank you very much.
Thank you very much.